And just a quick summary, we see that in the train group, in terms of like the partial pressure of carbon dioxide due to the hyperventilation, there's a decrease of carbon dioxide in the train group, which leads to blood pH increasing or alkalosis. And then we also see that the subjective measures of the flu-like symptoms from endotoxemia are much lower in the train group than the control group. There was a big difference in terms of epinephrine, both at the start of the experiment and also from the actual exposure to endotoxemia. The kind of increased levels of epinephrine were much greater in the train group compared to the control group. There was also concomitant kind of measured differences in terms of the white blood cell count. The train group seemed to have a significantly larger white blood cell count, and then there's a difference in the array of cytokines was released or measured in the train group. So what does that all mean? Let's go into the discussion and dig a little bit deeper. So the authors start by saying that the short training program and practicing breathing techniques result in release of epinephrine, induction of early anti-inflammatory IL-10 production, and consequently attenuation of the pro-inflammatory innate immune response during experimental human endotoxemia. That trained individuals experienced fewer endotoxemia-associated flu-like symptoms and a more swift normalization of fever and cortisol levels. This study demonstrates that in vivo innate immune response can be voluntarily influenced in a non-pharmacological manner through voluntary activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So this is a very important point here. This is a non-pharmacological manner. Normally, you would, let's say, take epinephrine in a pill form or whatever, maybe IV, as a way to reduce the sympathetic nervous, to activate the sympathetic nervous system in order to reduce the immune response. But you can do this. It's still pharmacological in a way but it's endogenous if you think about it, because your own body produces the epinephrine and releases it. And so through the breathing technique, meditation, cold exposure, I'm sure all these things work together to help someone to be able to voluntarily activate this release of epinephrine in order to activate the sympathetic nervous system and suppress the flu-like immune response symptoms. Here the authors say, in agreement with previously performed study where epinephrine was IV administered before lipopolysaccharide, which is the endotoxin, in healthy volunteers, and resulted in early and increased IL-10 production, and with studies showing that pre-treatment with IL-10 results in attenuation of the pro-inflammatory response in healthy volunteers. So there you go. There's already some evidence that kind of supports the same thing where, like I said, you could give someone through IV, I guess, epinephrine, or you could have someone produce epinephrine endogenously through the breathing techniques. And we see that both seem to have similar results in that you basically have an early and increased production of this IL-10, interleukin 10, the anti-inflammatory cytokine. And furthermore, there's even some preliminary evidence that says that if you give someone IL-10 to begin with, right before you give them the endotoxin, then you will have the similar response as well in terms of reducing the inflammatory response. So what accounts for all this? Is it the meditation, the breathing techniques, the cold exposure? The authors say here, mainly the breathing techniques used by the trained individuals account for the increase in epinephrine and subsequent attenuation of the inflammatory response. So the authors attribute it to the breathing. A limitation of our study design is that it does not allow the identification of the particular component of the practiced breathing exercises that results in increased epinephrine levels. That's right, like I already said, we don't know if it's like the actual breathing, if it's the meditation, if it's the cold exposure, or a combination of all of them together. And even with the breathing techniques, there are two separate breathing techniques. Which one's more effective or which one's doing more? We don't have answers to those questions. However, the effects on epinephrine are likely a consequence of both the hyperventilation phase and hypoxia due to breath retention, as both have been demonstrated to increase epinephrine levels. Yeah, so that's right. Because the breath retention is quite long, right? When you do the hyperventilation and you expel all that carbon dioxide from the bloodstream, What that allows you to do is to hold your breath or do the breath retention for much longer, approaching 2 minutes. Some people do it for longer, up to 3 or 4 minutes. So with that extreme amount of breath retention, that is the, I think, signal. That's what Wim Hof at least says is the signal for the release of the epinephrine levels. And so it's almost like a trick, because normally you would not be able to hold your breath or let the oxygen saturation in the body to go down so significantly without the hyperventilation. But because you do the hyperventilation, then you do the breath hold, and you're able to hold your breath for such a long period of time, you're inducing the stress response, even though you're in a very calm kind of environment. Obviously, when you do these breathing techniques, if you don't have the endotoxemia going on at the same time, you can be in quite a calm state. And while in this calm state, you're reducing the stress response of releasing epinephrine, which can have this impact on attenuating the inflammatory response. Here the authors say the attenuated cytokine response is unlikely to be a direct result from the low partial pressure of carbon dioxide and high pH levels, because it is not associated, those things are not associated with anti-inflammatory effects. Therefore, epinephrine is the most probable intermediate factor. Right. So I think, like I said, the low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that's really what's able to someone to hold their breath for a long period of time. And that's really most likely the reason behind the high levels of epinephrine release. In terms of the high blood pH and the alkalosis, I'm sure that has some sort of effect. I'm not sure what exactly the effect is, but that's another question for another study, of course. And another shortcoming of the study is the authors say that it remains to be determined whether the results of this study using an acute model of inflammation in healthy volunteers can be extrapolated to the patients with chronic autoimmune disease. So yeah, I mean, in this particular experiment, it's acute inflammation because you are acutely exposed to endotoxin, right? They gave them an IV kind of bolus of endotoxin, or this lipopolysaccharide. And so making a claim that this breathing technique could be helpful for people with chronic immune disease, specifically autoimmune disease, might be a bit of a stretch. So again, more research, more data is needed to be collected to be able to answer questions such as, can the results from this study be applied to people with chronic autoimmune diseases? The authors end with, in conclusion, the present proof of principle study demonstrates that the sympathetic nervous system and immune system can be voluntarily influenced through practicing techniques that are relatively easy to learn within a short time frame. It therefore could have important implications for the treatment of a variety of conditions associated with excessive or persistent inflammation, especially autoimmune diseases. Some of the drawbacks that I already mentioned is the fact that they didn't use all the volunteers that got trained in the actual endotoxemia study. Also, the fact that the study is pretty small. There were only 30 volunteers for the whole thing. So it's hard to make large sweeping generalizations based on that. However, the fact that many of the measurements, the differences in measurements, were statistically significant despite the low number of volunteers in the study gives me confidence in the fact that the differences we're seeing are actually important and valuable to note. I think it was quite impressive, the fact that Wim Hof only had 4-5 days to help these trained individuals to get ready for this endotoxemia study, and to show that not only is he able to have such a big difference in how his body responds to this experiment, but he's able to show other people in a short duration of time to be able to learn and be able to do these things. Of course, the most impressive part of this whole thing is the fact that you're voluntarily having an impact on your sympathetic nervous system through these breathing techniques. And the sympathetic nervous system, like I already said, is part of the autonomic nervous system, which was never believed to be something that you could voluntarily influence through actions you take. But to me, this study provides clear evidence that it can be done and it can be learned. And of course, like I already said, this has implications for autoimmune disease, as if we can, dampen the immune response, potentially we can keep autoimmune disease more in check. But it's too early to jump to those conclusions. Of course, the results of this are quite stunning and suggest that we should follow up and do more research and kind of pick up the breadcrumbs one at a time and see what more data we can collect and more conclusions we can come to. But it's still too early to say that autoimmune disease could be cured through doing something like these breathing techniques. Thanks for checking out that video. I hope you liked it. Here are a couple more for you to check out. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to my channel.